autotelic foundry.
Today is going to be a little bit experimental. I haven't done this lecture before, I just came up with it yesterday, but I thought it would be interesting to talk to you guys about fascism, given the state of affairs. So I'm going to keep it quite short, and then hopefully we have time to discuss together. So I really like the title of the conference, Model Collapse. Computer science is notoriously good with coming up with strange terminologies. Mostly they're quite oblivious to doing so. So when you told me the title of the conference, Model Collapse, I thought I can do you one better. And I'm going to name my talk Optimal Brain Damage. So as you see in the background, some people might recognize the image. Anyone? So this was the infamous AlphaGo tournament where in 2016 Go grandmasters were for the first time defeated by machine learning systems. Go being a game that was traditionally held to be sort of intuitive and intelligent, not like chess, which is purely numbers. But so this was really a turning point in the history of machine learning. But optimal brain damage, what could that be?
What happens after the club?
Pretty much, yeah. So the funny thing about optimal brain damage is I came across the term when I was studying computer science about 20 years ago, and it is actually a technical term from machine learning. It's one of the prevailing paradigms of how to optimize a system. Again, I find it very interesting if we think about how technologies shape reality, but also, of course, how terminologies do that. So in a sort of mimetic way, I think what we have done since then, this is a paper from 1989, so quite a while ago, is that optimal brain damage serves as a quite productive metaphor, actually, for the way that machine learning systems treat the world. And artificial intelligence is currently sort of on the way of optimizing everything, but also trying to sort of fit everything into a certain kind of system and do away with clutter. Optimal brain damage is very simple. It's basically saying if you do a neural network, if you build one, if you want to make it sufficiently complex, at some point it's going to get too much. So you have to sort of cut it here and there. It's a technique called pruning. One of the first author of this paper is Yann LeCun. He is the current head of FAIR, Facebook Artificial Intelligence Research, nice title also, and I think 2 or 3 time winner of the Turing Prize, so he's one of the grand seigneurs of machine learning. And it all started out here. It's just a very short clip I wanted to show you. So this is shortly after the optimal brain damage video paper was written in the early 1990s somewhere in a basement in a research lab. And what you see here is character recognition. So seems very basic to us today, but this is something quite complex at that time. But it also goes to show that technologies, of course, are created in a certain historical and social and cultural context. In this case, wait till the camera pans around. So if we think about this sort of, hegemonies of machine learning corporations today, it's quite interesting to see that it started out with a couple of guys. I'm sorry, this keeps looping. So, before we go straight into fascism, I wanted to go a little bit further back because I promised to talk also about sort of the very diverse histories of machine learning, which is a research topic of mine that's been with me for quite a while now. I've been researching the history of the knowledge transmission between China and the West, starting in the 17th century, but something very interesting happens also before and after World War II. So Norbert Wiener, the founder of Cybernetics, is actually a guest professor at Tsinghua University in the 1930s. And if you look at that more closely, it kind of makes sense to at least suspect that some of these sort of very circular and organic philosophies of cybernetics at least have some sort of Chinese inspiration. And in 1949, very shortly after the publication of his book Cybernetics, which shaped our culture, or is still shaping our culture until today, he receives this letter from a Chinese friend named Yuanren Chao, where he does this very, very consequential thing of suggesting that computers should play Go. So this is sort of the loop back to the mess that we're in right now. Yuanren Chao is a very interesting figure, linguist, became very prominent when in 1922 he published the first Chinese translation of Alice in Wonderland, which became a fantastic hit in China and spawned 2 sequels, because of course after Wonderland, you know. But also it is also sort of an instance of optimal brain damage, because at that time he was involved in the Chinese language reform, which was a very big endeavor starting in the early 20th century and then subsequently finished by Mao after World War II. But so there was the idea that after colonialism and all of these things, the very, very large cosmos of Chinese characters and traditional Chinese script was to be simplified. The interesting thing being that there was always speculation that Chinese was inherently illogical, couldn't produce logic because of the lack of grammatical structures, etc. So Alice, written by Charles Dodgson, who was a logician, and you know that Alice includes a lot of logic riddles, served as a sort of, you could say, literary algorithm for demonstrating that it is very possible to translate logical concepts into Chinese. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but it's quite interesting to see what happens in the 20th century before machine learning comes up. So it's very much all about optimization, about simplification, about sort of, I think optimal brain damage applies really well. If you look at the Chinese, traditional Chinese characters and the simplified Chinese characters, you can see how they're sort of, you know, snipped and snapped. Yuanren Chao was also, after World War II, you can see him here, the only Chinese member of the Macy conferences. So there is sort of a Chinese undercurrent in cybernetics that's been largely forgotten, actually. So cybernetics shapes Western culture and Western academia and Western thinking and ideology like no other ideology, actually. So what results from that is, of course, Silicon Valley, is, of course, the Ivy League university system, universities like Stanford, and a certain idea how to develop technologies, develop culture, hand in hand with at least pretending nature, but on the other hand, actually sort of implementing a capitalist logic, a labor logic, into a machinery system and making it process the world. The academic culture that emerges then is something that, you know, with the student movement of the 1960s and counterculture, has been largely regarded as a, well, it's a history that we've been told already, and I think we've been told that enough somehow, that it's about a very liberal approach to knowledge, but always with this sort of, you know, seedy underbelly of military-industrial complex that's going on in the US. But what also happens is that with the trickster culture and counterculture, things like the Principia Discordia, Discordianism start, and hacker culture starts to emerge somehow. So for those of you unfamiliar with this, Principia Discordia is a very strange collection of sort of mental hacks, but it's the idea of mindfuckery. So it's the idea that if you create something by rumor, if you seed information into the world, you can inevitably sort of create a reality or invoke something or make something appear out of thin air, actually. This is, interestingly enough, I think 1963 that this book is published, and the first issue was printed and this is not a conspiracy theory, on the printer of this guy, what's his name, David Garrick, who was the Attorney General in the JFK assassination trials. So if you've seen JFK by Oliver Stone, the guy that Kevin Costner plays. So this book somehow brings itself into being in a way that's already, it does what it describes. In the next decade, this guy, Richard Dawkins, comes up with the concept of memetics, which basically, can someone explain memetics quickly?
That's your job.
I'm sorry, usually I'm used to teaching, so I always ask questions.
I mean, it starts biologically, right? It's like it's a way of understanding biological systems. Right?
It's a way of understanding biological systems. It's a way of sort of describing how some things evolve, you could say. But this is then again applied to the concept of information. So you have sort of a genetic concept of information that gets, that sort of, starts to procreate, that starts to mutate, and in the end ends up on 4chan. So this is the 90s. So we had the 1960s here with Principia Discordia, something also that's been taken up by hacker culture in the 1980s and 90s quite intensely. In the 1970s, we have this concept of memetics starting to circulate, and then very early on, actually much earlier than I originally thought, we have this the movement of the alt-right starting. So. When do you think, when would you estimate, and how? Where did the alt-right start? Because we're in Austria, we know where Nazis come from.
68.
Well, sort of, yeah. I mean, it starts quite early on, and it starts with this. Anyone recognize? It's to me, it's a very stunning logo because it looks very, very fascist. So the color coding and also like the sort of, the dark sun image and the sigil there. But it is the logo of the Stanford Review. So Stanford University has a university paper, which was founded by a young student in the early 1980s named Peter Thiel. So what happens there is that counterculture gets sort of turned on its head. Yeah? So you have a new generation of students. You could say a first generation of sort of geeks and computer nerds also, who are still, because of the sort of prevailing academic culture and high school culture in the US, where you have jocks and geeks and cheerleaders and whatever, are sort of repressed in a way, and they start to mobilize in a way around Peter Thiel, who says that, well, basically, I'm going to see how far I can go. So the first issues of the Stanford Review are incredibly, incredibly provocative. It's really about sort of legitimizing fraternity rape culture and stuff like this, but it's really not about the very ideology that they present in the issues of the magazine, but it's very much about just seeing how far you can push the discourse, Because if you move the window of discourse to a certain range, you don't actually have to do the really, provocative stuff, but it gives you a lot of space to operate. So that's very interesting because it's a strategy that has been ever since propagated by the right wing, and is still being used today. That if you push the discourse in some radical way somehow, it gives you a lot of moving space for whatever kind of policy you want to do. Trump is probably the perfect example, because he will just say anything and people will get very excited about it, but behind that he's been signing decrees all over, So this is in the 1980s, and it's quite interesting because it has been largely ignored, I think. And it's time that we start to look at these things and also see that this is combined with a critical theory and a whole body of theory that also has been ignored by, you could say, mainstream academia and also left-wing academia. So what's interesting is that while the critical theory, as it evolves in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, becomes ever more complex and fragmented, what comes into play here are theories that are crackpot in a way, really weird, actually bad theory you could say, but I come to that in a second. But they get implemented. So what we see today, if we look at the way that the internet is shaped right now and the way that politicians are acting, it actually has a theoretical history, a very interesting philosophical history, but we'll come to that in a second. So early 1990s, there is sort of a counter movement that's, I think, very interesting for us here today, also because Michelle Cotton is here, the curator of the very fantastic show Radical Software at Kunsthalle, which you should all see. So at the University of Warwick in the UK in the early 1990s, a research group convenes. You couldn't even say it's sort of a, yeah, it's almost legendary or mythical, this research group. It's called the CCRU, the Cybernetic Cultures Research Unit. And in this still sort of, left-leaning, Deleuzian-inspired research group, you have a couple of really sort of pivotal figures of media theory in the early stages, one of them being Nick Land, to whom we come in a second. And this is sort of the overall mood, I think. So we have Nick Land, a couple of other people, and then, of course, very prominently and importantly, Sadie Plant. You can buy the book here. I highly recommend it. Who writes this book, Zeros and Ones, which is, for the first time, I mean, I probably don't have to explain it to most of you, but it's a foundational book of media theory. It's very much shaped how we think about, or how we should think about digitality and non-binarity of technologies and stuff like this. But shortly, this is sort of mirrored by, it breaks apart. Actually, still in the 1990s, the CCRU breaks apart because Nick Land becomes sort of, he goes crazy and he sort of disappears and starts to write weirder and weirder theory fiction. Sadie Plant leaves the CCRU, largely sort of also drops out of theory making. Does a study for Motorola, which I translated actually. And the theory sort of lives on, but in a sort of underground way, quite interesting. Peter Thiel then in 2014 writes sort of the anti-zeros and ones, writes this book, 021. And I want to point out that this slight grammatical difference is quite telling actually, because while we have a plurality here, we have zeros and ones, and we have a sort of a thinking together of these concepts. What we have here is just a movement from nothing to something. And this is a speculation that I have because I'm a Leibnizian. It's quite interesting because this is a quote of Leibniz when he publishes his binary number system in the late 17th century. Unus ex nihilo omnia, unum autatem necessarium. One has created something from nothing. So if you look into this book, 021, I just skimmed around a little bit, I have to admit, I didn't read it. It's very hard to read these things because they're really bad. But this caught my eye, and I found it very interesting that Thiel would make sort of a comparison between the Unabomber and the way that Silicon Valley hipsters look. It never occurred to me, really. But it fits very well into my narrative because something quite interesting happened around the time when we met in Berlin. A art movement started to come around called post-internet art. Most of you are probably familiar with it. And was quite interesting in the way that they adapted to theory. I really like working with artists because they are very agile in adapting theories and playing around with them, for better or worse, So what happened with post-internet artists is some people became quite susceptible to Nick Land and a theory called accelerationism, which most of you are probably familiar with, the idea of accelerationism, which is a sort of, it's a very masturbatory theory. It's sort of, very, very highly trained theory language. And it's about accelerating capitalism until it sort of destroys itself, which of course it's not going to happen, So lots of these post-internet artists start to sort of get into this ideology and ideas of the neo-reactionary movement, which is starting to form based on the theories of Nick Land. And this is a work by Dan Keller of H3D, who at a government auction bought the backpack of the Unabomber and put it in an exhibition. But interestingly enough, also at that time, and this was sort of the first time that I heard about it, there was a notorious gallery in London called Eddy 50, which hosted a conference for neo-reactionary thinkers. And it was one of the first instances of sort of, you could say, cancel culture in a way. So there was a lot of conflict and discussion about whether this should be able to happen, whether they should be able to and allowed to hold this conference. In the end, the gallery had to close, and the conference did not happen. But what did happen is sort of this series from neo-reactionary alt-right movement acceleration started to seep into mainstream culture until today, where in the work of DOGE, we find the very real-world application of optimal brain damage. Also, I think DOGE kind of encapsulates a lot of the concepts that we've talked about already, because of course in DOGE you have the Doges of Venice, you have Dogecoin, where it actually started with Elon Musk, and it comes from the Italian word duce, so it's the leader principle, and now it's the Department of Government Efficiency, so this is sort of mimetic warfare of the finest. But what happens here, of course, is a concept of, can we apply optimal brain damage to the real world? Can we, basically by at least pretending to optimize something, completely disinstall government or democratic structures, and sort of hide behind this paradigm that the tech industry has been hiding behind for a long time, that technologies are somehow purely functional, that they are practical, that they just do something and they just do what they're told, they're neutral, they don't have ideologies. So this is basically the idea that is being put forth to actually obscure something that's going on behind, which Eric Salvaggio has termed an AI coup. So far, it seems that all of this is just happening in the US, or even like the more evil China, where everyone is surveilled. And but I have to disappoint you. So Sebastian Kurz, when he stepped down from being the Austrian Chancellor, started a job at Palantir, which is Peter Thiel's surveillance and data company, and has just recently founded a company called Dream Security, which is together with Shalef Julio, who's one of the founders of the NSA Group, an Israeli cybersecurity firm, one of the really evil guys. And they basically want to do the same thing in Austria. So the idea is, or in Europe, to create surveillance, but also sort of AI-based security systems that can be implemented in government. All of this is also based, because I said I would talk about theory, on this little guy. And this guy is Curtis Yarvin, who in the early 2000s started writing a really sort of, crackpot theory. You could call it, I really tried reading it. It's hard, and it's, I learned the term gooning from my colleague Shaka McLaughlin, who's here in the front row, which is sort of an endless masturbatory loop that people get themselves in. And I think this is sort of, you could call it theory gooning, what happens when you do this. Also, he didn't really age well. But he got a makeover recently because suddenly people like J.D. Vance read him. you know? So this is, and that's what I want to discuss with you today, is how did we let it happen that really bad theory with really bad ideologies gets implemented in politics? Why don't we, where are we, what did we do? Where did we fail? Because we have better theories than that. And I think we should try to implement them. So Nick Land termed the term the dark enlightenment, where he sort of brought together the ideas of Curtis Yarvin and sort of put it into a manifesto form, which really, really very much informed a lot of right-wing thinkers and politicians all over the world. So, and it still sort of confuses the fuck out of me to think that this is a small booklet. You can read it, but it's a blueprint for what's happening right now in the US. It's a blueprint for what's starting to happen in many, many other places in the world. And I think it is our responsibility to offer countercultural techniques, to offer counter theories to that, and to think how we want to implement theory. Because at the moment, I think theory is moving further away from practice as ever. And we sort of, you know, start to just disindividuate in theories. And then we come back to model collapse. So theories beget theories, and nothing really happens. And what we end up, and with this I close, is a new term I want to call the dork enlightenment. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul. I mean, so important to historicize the contemporary. I mean, the idea that everything happens all at once and that it's sort of untethered from kind of, well, historical processes and real networks of power is something that we really need to kind of, you know, push back against. I wonder if anyone would like to ask Paul, for example, what kind of theory do we need? Bait and switch.
I'm not really sure. I mean, I think the theories are out there. I think the problem that we have is not that we're lacking the theories. It's we have somehow unlearned to implement theory and to sort of translate them into community, translate them into political systems, translate them into technologies, because we have been led to believe that these technologies are, as I said, void of ideology, that they are not implementations of a certain theory, which they are. And so even in media theory, which is my field, you have this thing that we sort of retreat from the technologies. We've been in a cycle of lots of interesting thinkers telling us how dangerous these technologies is, but nothing ever happens. So the question is, how can we move further and then transform this into design processes, transform it into new forms of community? And yeah, that's what I'm here to discuss with you and not to offer the solution.
So I'll ask one more question before I hand it over to the audience. Yeah. Theory in practice. Paul, as far as I understand it, you have been involved in writing the AI what standards for use of AI standards for your university. So, like, concrete question, like, what do you think about the introduction or the acceptance of ChatGPT into, say, student essays or into like university processes? How's your theory informing your work on that kind of topic?
It is, yeah. Well, every university wants an AI strategy at the moment, and all of them are quite useless. Because you say, well, we're definitely going to use it in ethical ways, and nobody's going to cheat, and fair use. But of course, these technologies are designed in a way that they just do that, whether you want it or not. So at some point, because they are connected to desire also, and they sort of extract desire from you, they will just make you do that. So the question is, I think, well, in one hand, of course, we can develop strategies how to use them, and I think art is very useful in doing so. On the other hand, I think we have to sort of, again, rethink how the institutions work also. So in my case, for example, I find it highly, highly wonderful to have sort of verbal exams with my students again, which I considered very old-fashioned for a long time and didn't want to do, but to have an actual conversation about something instead of a badly written paper. That is also because the university system is designed in a way that, you know, the term ends, they have to hand in the paper 2 weeks after. Nothing good comes from that. So we have to rethink the curricula, we have to rethink the scheduling of how we produce work, how we conceive, because we have been trained by now to have technologies that really just do what we want instantly. So we are trained on instant gratification, trained on like really just getting, like little kids, just, you know, getting what we want instantly because we want it now. And I think we have to sort of step back and we have to maybe even go the hard way and say that, well, sometimes you have to invest some work and time and concentration because you don't have this, maybe we have to cut out this middleman of technology sometimes. That is not to say that I'm a Luddite, but I think it is something that we have to rethink, how we teach, how we study together, how we create art.
Thank you. So, yes, the audience, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, it's directly following up on that. In university, I mean, there are three contexts, right? We're interested in the output, we're interested in the evaluation, an exam, or we're interested in the learning. So the output is not so relevant in studying, right? We don't need more bad term papers. But we're interested in evaluating people, okay, so you do oral exams, but then there's the learning. And the difficulty I've had to wrap my head around this is to see the difference between, let's say we used to think that mental calculus was important, and then we got, you know, the calculators, and now everybody thinks, oh, it's impressive if you can do mental calculus, but it's unnecessary. And the problem I have right now with these technologies is to try to figure out where to draw the line. I used to take 2 days to read a philosophical essay when I was an undergraduate, and I think I learned something valuable. Now I could feed it to ChatGPT and get all the bullet points and still talk about it in class. But the learning would be gone. Or would it? And if it's gone, is it a problem in the future? Because people would say, well, you can now always feed forever articles into ChatGPT. You don't need that learning anymore. It's an irrelevant skill to have in the future. And there's where I see the difficulty. I don't know if you have
That's true. Yeah. I mean, coming back to Leibniz, who fascinated me also for the reason that he was so lazy. You know, Leibniz, as you know, sort of polymath, worked in every field imaginable, but he did it with the motivation of laziness. He said, I want to make things more practical, so I'm going to invent a mathematical notation, some kind of tool to do it. And at some point he said, well, actually, yeah, it would be great if I didn't have to do these calculations myself. So he envisioned an army of mathematicians or a computer. So this is something that as a paradigm is very prevalent in sort of in computational culture, you could say. And if we consider Western culture, computational culture from at least the 16th century onwards, maybe even longer. So something that is interested in translating any kind of reality into a computable system that makes it then easier to sort of digest and process, then we arrive where we are right now. And the thing is, yeah, where to draw the line. That's why I say I'm not against or for the implementation and use of ChatGPT or other. I mean, this is also, it's so fun because I'm talking about these AI topics for a long, long time now. And it's already, I can already imagine in like 2 years when we look back at what we're talking about today, and it's going to be very naive and boring because it's going to be even more hellish. But yeah, it's hard to say where to draw the line. I think it's very much about responsibility. It's very much about developing certain cultural standards and sort of to continue to negotiate these boundaries, because the line continues to be drawn, and it's not a binary thing.
I have 2 questions, one here, one there. We'll start with you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And I fully agree with your concern, I would say, about needing better theory. At the same time, I might be a bit more pessimistic already watching what kind of theory becomes then mainstream. Do you think, so two things, do you think that maybe one of the shifts in media theory towards the more material and flattening and so on and so forth, which is intellectually amazing and great and fantastic, but made it a bit harder to be politically more radical in the sense of critiquing the bad guys? Because it's, yeah, we don't really focus so much on entities anymore and naming certain political shifts. And the other thing, I'm rather worried about that certain theories that become or make it are based on the grounds of being economically useful. And this is what worries me kind of more, because now we have the debate with AI and consciousness and so on, and it's not a yes-no debate, it's who will frame what consciousness is. These theories will win, and they are the ones that are applicable to the context of products and selling AI. So, yeah.
Thank you. But it's interesting to see, because the sort of move in media theory from when I started studying it in the early 2000s, it was all about the immateriality, and and you thought, well, but there are sort of, because suddenly we had laptops and we had Wi-Fi, and people started to think that data was something ephemeral, while at the same time all of these infrastructures were being built. So I think what bothers me most is sort of the latency between theory and practice. So we're always a step behind. We can always just look at what's being implemented and then theorize it or criticize it or critique it. And what I think would interest me is trying to find new forms of collaboration also in design processes, for example, and also on the academic level, because if you look at the academic education of computer scientists, if they have an academic education, or if it's like a Fachhochschule, technical school kind of thing, you won't find any course there that sort of contextualizes computers in general. Do you teach one? Yes. Fantastic.
So I have one at the back, then one here, then one here. We'll see how far we get. But while I walk back here, may I please plug the merchandise? You can buy T-shirts and hats over there. It all helps the Kunsthalle make more good art program.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask about what you think about the value of crackpot theories. I feel like the removal or the kind of ignoring of kind of crackpot or outlier theory is kind of another name for model collapse. And with Curtis Yarvin in particular, I think he's kind of responsible for one of the most important quotes of the 21st century. I'm not an alt-right person, I'm a left, if anything, I say if I am, but which his quote was a kind of rhetorical statement in one of his blogs in 2007 where he says, one day I was working in my garage and I built an ideology. And that's present here in this program in Joshua Citarelli's flags that was mentioned in Nadim's presentation. It's present in the work of new models, who are essentially an enclave building what they kind of perceive as being correct media theory, perhaps. So these kind of things exist, and I'm kind of curious in your engagement with all these different types of crackpot theories or bad theories, whether you've extracted any valuable points from them.
Well, I mean, first of all, I have to say that I'm a big fan of crackpot theories. I think theory has to be, it has to be sort of as heterogeneous as possible. It has to be but it's about diversity, But it's also about, at some point, setting certain boundaries because there are theories that are inhumane. There are theories that are intolerant, that are hateful, that are anti-democratic, and it's okay to take a stance there, because of course we can say research and art are free, and everything has to be tolerated in that. But once a theory like the one of Curtis Yarvin gets implemented into the destruction of democratic systems in one of the most powerful countries in the world, I think it's okay to say I want to resist that. Also, I'm not saying that I'm against crackpot theory and for sort of a unified theory, or what they would call the cathedral, So I'm just saying I think it's not about the theory per se that I'm worried. It's about the way of theory making and how we develop theory, how we engage with different modes and modalities of thought and how we try to translate them into other actions, which could be the development and design of technologies or making art or designing a community. That's what I mean. And I don't have an answer. It's really just, it bothers me that they built the wrong one into, you know?
So one more question over here.
Thank you. I just want to come back to this question about bad theory, but this time in connection with desire or pleasure, which you kind of made mention of, because it seems that there's just this moment that you've charted so nicely here, but it goes from the kind of revenge of the nerds to the destruction of the sort of wrought by the nerds. The dork enlightenment is something a little different than the kind of revenge of the nerds in which they get the girl because they knew the tech all along. And it seems like that's connected to this question of who gets to enjoy writing good theory, bad theory, and is there something about writing theory that involves destruction, and maybe the right has taken over that pleasure from the left, from the kind of critical theories.
It is very much that, actually, because if you look at how Peter Thiel in the 1980s argues against what they call, you know, the academic establishment. In their viewpoint, the left has taken over the universities and is in a dictatorial way, you know, pushing their ideologies on the students, and they see themselves as liberators and as knights somehow. But I think desire and pleasure are really great things. But you can find desire and pleasure in creation or destruction. You can find it in communion and community. I think for me it's always quite valuable to think about technologies and theory and all of this in terms of drugs. Because apparently, like we are as a civilization and as a species, we are eager to put drugs inside of us and to get intoxicated and to experiment with that. And technologies today, like TikTok and all of these, they are designed and to function in the very same way. We know that. It's not even a conspiracy theory or a secret. You can find it in every white paper that is designed to engage you in a way that makes you addicted. And the question is whether we want to design them in a way that, fosters community and makes us love each other and maybe expand our minds, or if we just want to get really fucked up.
Last question, and then we have to break for just a short amount of time for our next talk, but I know you were waiting.
Thanks so much for the great talk. So coming from an American context, this question about theory like making its move sort of more broadly in a public, you know, the right had huge success in developing a media infrastructure, like a whole misinformation, disinformation, propaganda thing that I think that the left never achieved, certainly not the academic left. And I guess the question, you know, for me in this moment also becomes, well, is this the moment that we actually have to, like, you know, embrace that, or at least embrace the tools that we have available to cut through? But I was thinking about the pedagogical scene also, and moving back to oral exams and like the conversation in 2 years. Like what are we talking about? You know, I can imagine that if my students can still learn something, quote unquote, cheating while using AI, but it gives them room to start moving into something like a poetics. Like there's something interesting happening if we let our students just like run willy-nilly with AI. Then the disciplinary academy kind of potentially falls apart, you know, like, which could be an interesting, you know, project itself. And then just this last thing that you said about drugs, I think, I've been thinking about addiction and technology for many, many years. And, you know, I think we have, you know, it's like, what drug do you want? You know, do you want MDMA or do you want like Coke? I think we haven't figured that out quite yet either.
We haven't, but I love what you're saying. We're co-teaching at the moment, so I'm very optimistic about that.
Okay, everyone, thank you. I could tell this conversation could go on for a long time, but it actually is just through another modus, and that is our next speaker coming up. I'm going to run it just 5 past the hour, so you have about 10 minutes. That's Elke Schwarz on new militarism, tech fetishism, and artificial idiocy. So we're going to keep it light. Get ready, have a drink, go to the loo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.